Welcome to the Creation Care Pathway as part of ACU Summit 2020. My name is Jim Carpenter, and no, I will not be speaking tonight. You don't have to suffer through that. Instead, you get to listen to John Mark Hicks speak. He is a professor of theology at Lipscomb University, where he has been since 2000. He's taught in higher education in Churches of Christ for over 38 years. He is going to speak to us now on Psalms 104. And so, John, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you all for being part of this.
Well, thank you, Jim. But thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the invitation to be here and to talk about this really important topic. I'm very much enthused about the topic of the environment and our relationship to the creation and creation care as a important theological as well as scientific and part of our existence. And my task is to speak somewhat into a theological basis here. That is a huge topic. How theology informs our sense of creation care is, I think, a foundational dimension of the whole approach to creation care as Christians, because we bring a worldview to this, we bring a sense of creation to this. And so creation care, there's a theology of creation that is linked to the kind of care that creation deserves, and it's part of our human vocation. I think when we think about the human vocation, we go back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, where God blessed them, male and female, and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the earth and rule over the fish of the sea and the animals, and so rule over the creation." And when I think about the human vocation, I see kind of three things going on there. And there's different ways of breaking this down, I suppose. But the three that I see is fill the earth. Male and female to fill the earth, which I don't think is just about propagation or about biology, but it's also about filling the earth with the images of God, filling the earth with the representatives of God. That is, filling the earth is not only about population, at least in its original context, but it's also about the kind of population we're filling it with. So that when we come to the New Testament, fill the earth is still part of the agenda. But that filling is making disciples, making people into the image of God, in the image of Christ, in the image of God, and creating that image in them by the power of the Spirit and transformation. So filling is still part of the human vocation, but it's also part of the kingdom vocation of the church, of the body of Christ. But there's also that subduing. And this is the one that is a little tricky, because we wonder, well, what is there to subdue? That's a pretty aggressive term, and it is. It's often a term used in military context. To subdue, I think, as Brueggemann and Fredheim and others have suggested, the idea of subduing here is about subduing the chaos, to order the chaos, to continue the work of creation. Because what God did in creating the world was take this chaotic reality and order it so that there's habitable space. And then in that habitable space, human beings take up the task of co-creating with God, whether it's co-creating in population through having children, as well as filling the earth, but it's also co-creating with God in subduing the chaos, in ordering the world, much like you might domesticate your tall grass in your backyard, and manicure it, and that's a form of subduing. But the other is rule. So fill, subdue, and rule. And the word rule, again, hits us a little strong, because we're a democracy and we don't like tyrants and we don't like rulers. We want something more representative. But I think if we hear the word rule in the framework of Israel's theology of rule, which is about shepherding, to shepherd the creation, if we frame it that way, I think it's a little more palatable. And I think it's more accurate. Because the kind of ruler that Israel needed and what God called for is the kind of ruler we see in, say, Psalm 72, which is a psalm that was probably used to celebrate the annual accession date or enthronement of the king. And the kind of ruler that is present there is the ruler that helps the weak, that supports the weak, that is oriented toward protecting and caring for the people rather than wielding a tyrannical kind of domination. So the human vocation is one of filling the earth, subduing the chaos, co-creating with God, and shepherding the creation, caring for the creation. And if you notice, the important dimension of that is how human beings, the human vocation, is a cooperative one with God that participates in the mission of God, the creative work of God, and the goal that God has for the creation itself. So human beings don't take on an autonomous shepherding task or an autonomous filling task or subduing task. We take on a cooperative task where we are God's partners, junior partners, we might say, but partners in participating in the mission of God. And so I'm going to share my screen here to talk about this a little bit. Here we go. Let's see how this works. Here we are. And I assume you can see Psalm 104, a theocentric theology of creation care. Someone tell me if that's not what you see. And so I want to go to this text because I think it does orient us appropriately in a meditation that is offered by the psalmist. The psalmist calls this a meditation. And the word he uses for meditation is not the normal kind of word for meditation. There are several different Hebrew words you can use, but this one is more often translated like complaint. It's a strong word. It's a passionate word. Even Job used this word to describe his words to God in the midst of the chaos that he was experiencing. And Job wasn't too patient about that. He was pretty angry and pretty bitter about it. So it's a very passionate word. So we might suggest that this psalm is a passionate, eager, aggressive reflection on the creation. Maybe a good word to say that is an exciting. The psalmist isn't just kind of in a lull meditation, but is in a engaging, energetic meditation about the creation. In other words, when the psalmist stops to reflect on the creation, this generates something. It generates a doxology. It generates a singing of praise. It evokes worship and awe. And so the function of this psalm is not so much to lay out kind of a scientific path, of course. It is rather to provide a space in which believers can enter to experience the world God created and the God who created it for the sake of doxology, to evoke the wonder and the awe. At the same time, it also reminds us of the orientation of creation. I have a little typology here that perhaps isn't everything we might want to make finer distinctions, and I understand that. But it just kind of in my mind, it's a helpful orienting way of thinking. That as we look at the creation, what's at the root? What's at the center? What is the function of the creation? What is the meaning of the creation? And I think these three broad type of typologies, you might say, are helpful. I think for some, creation is biocentric. That is, it's about life. And it's about, whether you're a kind of a naturalist or a mystic, that becomes very much a part of, we're just interested in the natural functionings and the life orientation and how we preserve life and how we help life and what life means in that kind of context. And I think there's some really helpful things about that, the interdependence of life. And so thinking of it in biocentric terms can be helpful, but I don't think it's foundational. I think it is reflective of some key themes, that life certainly is an operative principle in creation theology. Christians in the past seem at times, particularly in the use of technology and the exploitation of the earth, there's a tendency to think in anthropocentric terms. For example, on rule the creation, that has often been translated into something as negative as exploiting the creation. So to talk about anthropocentric is to say, this is about us. The creation is about humanity. It serves humanity. And that's what creation is supposed to do, right? And so everything about the creation then is seen through the lens of how does it help me? How does it help humanity? How does it help us? And it's all about our own self-interestedness. And I think that perspective has had a strong tradition in some aspects of the Christian life and thinking, and unfortunately so, because I don't think that is the biblical picture at all. I think rather it's more a theocentric understanding. That is, the creation is about God. And I want to explore that a little bit more here as we walk through Psalm 104. But fundamentally, the creation is to the glory of God. Now, when we hear glory, sometimes we think ego. You know, God needs the stroke of the ego, right? And I don't think that's the point of glory. I think it's more about relationality. It's more about investment. It's more about communion. It's more about God dwelling in the creation and enjoying and delighting in the creation and inviting humanity into the vocation and to share the mission and to co-create and to produce the future, to co-create the future and co-produce the future with humanity for the sake of creation. That's where God is glorified. And we'll see that here in the Psalm, that God's works are what bring God joy. And it's not about God's ego as much as it is about God's interest and love and wisdom and engagement and God's dwelling in the creation. And I think we can get at that through Psalm 104, at least in part. Now, there are other Psalms that do this. There are other creation texts throughout the whole of Scripture, of course. I mean, we could look at Psalm 19 or Psalm 33 or Psalm 29, and there are many others that are called kind of creation hymns. But this is the longest, and this is the most detailed. And I think there's something that we can gain from it by looking at it. This is the structure of Psalm 104. Not everybody's going to agree on this structure, of course. And, it's a poem. So how you structure the poem has something to say about what it means, what structure you perceive in it. This is from Goldingay's commentary on the Psalms. And I find it quite helpful to, and others have seen this kind of chiastic structure as well. I think it's very helpful because you see it, the psalm begins and ends the same way. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. In other words, as we think about creation, the framing of understanding creation is the sense of ascribing to God what belongs to God. It's not just a praise of Yahweh, it's a bless Yahweh. And blessing is a little different than praising, even though the NIV tends to translate blessing as praise. Blessing is more an ascription. So to bless Yahweh is to, as I look upon the creation, as I see the world that God has created, I want to ascribe to God all that belongs to God. Because this is the work of God. Bless Yahweh, oh my soul. So the experience of the creation is fundamentally a doxological one. It evokes a doxological response to bless God or to praise God. And the last words of the psalm are praise Yahweh, praise Yah. But then you see at the level of B, from near the beginning and near the ending of the psalm, that we had this sense of God's transcendent identity. And here, I think it's important to see this transcendent identity. God wraps light like a garment. God is transcendent to the creation, but God is also acting as creator. God is acting as provider. God is participant in the creating act and the ongoing reality of creation. And it is God's transcendence that allows God to do that. Right? God has the power, and God has the relation, and God has the situatedness, you might say, of his relation to the creation to act upon it and to dwell within it. And we have the hints here in Psalm 104 that we find in other places, like in Job 38 and even in Genesis 1, that what God is doing is building a temple. God lays the foundations, he spreads a tent, and it's almost like God's creating a tabernacle, that the creation itself is the tabernacle of God. And we see that, for example, in Isaiah 66. Who can, you're going to build me a temple? Hey, my hands have already made a temple. The heavens are my canopy, and the earth is my footstool. I dwell here, which is part of what the Sabbath is about. Because when God finishes creating, God doesn't then absent God's self from the creation and go off somewhere beyond the Hubble telescope. Rather, God comes to dwell within the creation. And that coming to dwell within the creation means that God is still active in the creation, but also God is resting in the creation, that God is enjoying the creation. So you have in B, not only the transcendent identity of God, but you also have this liturgical response to God's creative work, which is God's own response too. And we'll get to that text in just a moment. But I want to move to the ordering. Because when we look at God's ordering of the chaos, God's ordering of the waters, for example, in verses 5 to 9, which is part of Genesis 1. At the beginning, there were the waters, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the deep, and the darkness upon the waters, right? God took that chaos and ordered it into habitable space. But those chaotic waters then become a blessing to the creation. And so God's use of land and water creates habitable space for wild animals in the mountains, the mountain goats and the conies. But also the trees provide nesting places for the birds. In other words, when God is creating, it's not just that God is creating just for humanity. What we hear in the psalm is, we don't get to human beings until verse 14. What we hear in the psalm is that God is equally concerned with habitable space for the mountain creatures, for the conies. And God is equally concerned for habitable space for the birds, that they have a place to dwell, which might have implications for, how we use land as human beings. If we think the land is only about us and about using it for our interest and our comfort, and we don't give attention to that God also created the world as habitable space for animals, land animals, and birds, and we'll see in a moment the fish of the sea as well, then we're missing part of the point here. That would mean humanity is becoming egocentric, that humanity sees themselves as the center of the world, when it is God who is the center of the world. And it is God who created space, habitable space, for the birds and the fish and the land animals. So when God's bio-interest in the creation, God is interested in life, but it's God who is providing this life. It is God who is calling us into this life and providing space for that life, whether it's for the animals and their habitation, but also provisions for humanity. Humanity is not left out of that picture. In fact, humanity in verses 14 and 15 said, hey, God provides wine from vines to enjoy life, provides oil from trees to enhance human health, provides bread from grain to nourish the body. Creation does provide for humanity, but it also provides for the birds and the conies as well. And when God orders the chaos and orders the cosmos for life, God provides a rhythm to the cosmos. And that's where we get the sun and moon providing this rhythm of life. And a rhythm even for the life that exists between humans and animals. Now, this isn't discussed in any great detail, of course, in Psalm 104. But the darkness belongs to the animals in this picture we have, times without electricity, of course, where we can have the nightlife and live all the way through the night and not have to worry about seeing anything or being endangered by anything necessarily. But darkness is the time for the animals. The lions seek their prey in the darkness. But when light comes, lions retreat to their dens and people go out to work. So there's kind of a rhythm to the creation. Human beings sleep at night. The animals seek their prey at night. I think that is, of course, it's not a hard and fast rule by any stretch. This isn't about rules. It's about the kind of order that God brought to the creation. They give it a rhythm. And it's a rhythm where God is concerned about feeding the animals as well as feeding human beings, where animals can enjoy a life and human beings can enjoy life. And we see this particularly in verses 24 to 26, where the wisdom of God comes into play. You might remember Psalm 8, right, where Lady Wisdom is the one by whom God creates the world. So wisdom, God is creating something that fits. There's an order. There's a sense of coherency. There's a sense of this works, right? There's a pragmatism as well here. There is a rhythm and an order. So God has created with wisdom. And so the earth is full of God's creatures in a wisdom constructed reality, which has its own order and rhythms, including the sea. So we had the birds and we had the land animals. Now we get to see. Notice human beings are still not. We only had 2 verses about human beings so far. That's not the primary. We're looking at all that God created. But notice it refers to yonder is the sea, which is also a great fearful thing for ancient peoples. The sea is not one of those things that that people ran out to, right? It was a very fearful, chaotic reality. But it's great and wide, and creeping things innumerable are there, living things both small and great. There go the ships. There you have a reference to the human beings that share the sea with all the small and great animals, as well as the Leviathan, which is the great sea monster. And the sea monster, notice that you formed the sport in it. God created the Leviathan to play, the sea monster to play, which is kind of a climactic statement about the sea. The one thing that human beings fear the most, the Leviathan, the sea monster, God is so sovereign over that. And God is so intentional in the creation that God said, hey, I'm going to create a sea monster so I can watch the sea monster play. Much like we might watch weasels play, or any other sort of animal that our pets play, or cats play. Well, God's got a world that God watches and enjoys and delights in and watches it play. And you might say, God's got this aquarium. And I don't mean to say aquarium in the sense that God is simply an outsider to the reality, but no, God is present in the reality at work. But God has the joy of animals that human beings haven't even seen yet. We're still exploring species and exploring the sea. And God is enjoying the sea, even when we haven't seen it ourselves. Now, I need to move quickly here because I'm running out of time. But verses 27 to 30 are also about the rhythm of life and the dependency that all of life is dependent upon God. And that God's ruach, God's spirit, God's breath, God's wind, all those are appropriate translations of the Hebrew term, that this is what is operative in the world. That there is something more fundamental than the physical causations. There is something more rooted in God's active involvement, engagement, presence in the creation. That life isn't just something mechanistic, or life is not just something that arises out of the physical process in some kind of vacuum, but it's present in the context of God's breath that gives life and takes away life as well. And yet the last line here is, when you send forth your spirit, your ruach, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Renewal, which I think is a strong hint. God's agenda in creation is not ultimately destruction or annihilation. God's agenda in creation is renewal, growth, development, emergence. That the creation is intended to grow and develop, intended to evolve, intended to become more than what it is. And that human beings are co-producers with God in that. And that the creation itself is co-productive in that as well. Because in Genesis 1, let the earth bring forth, let the animals be fruitful and multiply, because he blessed the animals too. And let them be fruitful and multiply. So this is a holistic creation development where God is involved, and God gives processes to the creation to participate in this development and emergence for the sake of renewal. And so the psalmist says, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in all in his works. But we see in that meditation, in that exuberance that the psalmist has for the creation that he has just, or she, whoever this is, has described, is that God would rejoice in it. That God delights in the creation. God delights that birds have nesting places. God delights that conies have mountains where they can live. God delights in a sea full of animals. God delights in the rhythms of the creation, moon and sun. God delights in the light and the darkness for the sake of what the creation experiences and can do in those rhythms. God rejoices over God's works. And so the doxological response, I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. And may my meditation, may my aggressive, full, engaging, inciting, thrilling reflection on the creation, may God be honored by that as I rejoice in God. Just as God rejoices in the creation, so I rejoice in God. Just as God delights and rests in the creation, so I delight in the God who is the creator, because God is the one who is the orienting confession, the orienting person as I think about creation. Theocentric theology, theocentric understanding of creation care. And then we have this line that seems kind of strange, maybe. Let sinners be consumed from the earth and let the wicked be no more. It seems like a throwaway line, doesn't it? Like, okay, I got the end of this exciting reflection on creation, but let me just throw in, for good measure, we don't like wicked people. Now, what is the function of that line? I don't think it's a throwaway line. I think it's a warning. It's a warning that our culture needs to hear. It's a warning that the technology of our culture needs to hear. And that is, God is the destroyer of those who destroy God's world. That the wicked here and the sinners that are being described are not just kind of, random, abstract persons. They are the persons who do not see the world the way this psalmist sees the creation. And when we see it differently, when we think of it as anthropocentric, as human-centered and for human exploitation and for human interest alone, and only about human comfort, and we destroy the habitations of animals, and we destroy the sea with our plastic, I think the psalmist might very well say, let sinners be consumed from the earth and let the wicked be no more. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. Praise Yahweh. Thank you for your time and for your attention. We're open to have any questions if we have some.
I'm grateful for what you said, though. You've got, I had never looked at Psalm 104 from that perspective. I tend to read too much on the surface, I'm afraid. Especially the part where you're talking about God enjoying watching the Leviathan play in the sea. I've read that so many times, but I never, where it said he made it to play in the sea. But I've never thought about God sitting back and just enjoying watching it play the way I enjoy watching my dog play.
Yeah.
So I appreciate
that. It's really a strange line, isn't it? Because the Leviathan is something that, like Isaiah 27, verse 1, Leviathan is something people fear,
right,
and are afraid of.
Right.
But God's not afraid of it. God says, "Hey, I created that Leviathan. And I enjoy what that Leviathan does, is he's playing in the ocean." So, very interesting line.
John, I really appreciated your talk. And I also appreciated you talking about how humans are part of the interactions with God, and we're kind of subordinate, but we're co-creators in this situation. And that reminds me of kind of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, their idea of men being sub-creators, that we create. In their case, they were talking about creating art, but or literature, but we create as because we are made in the image of God, because we are image bearers. And so that was a fun parallel.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of applications. The idea that we're co-creators, we co-create children with God, right? We co-create art, we co-create history, we co-create the future itself, but we also co-create the material reality. And that's where technology can be a help in co-creating, that it can be a detriment as well. So that's why we have to take our vocation seriously and understand that our actions are to help the creation develop and emerge, not to destroy it and restrain it and to hinder its development. So that idea of co-creation has a very broad application. So thanks for sharing that part of it as well.
I just want to thank everyone for being part of this. And I want to thank Dr. Hicks for taking part in this and giving us these thoughts and giving me more to think about.